It is my honor to be welcoming our speaker this evening. Bedros Dermatosian completed his PhD in Middle East history at Columbia University. He spent several years lecturing at Massachusetts Institute of Technology and is currently an associate professor of modern Middle East history at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. His areas of interest include ethnic politics in the Middle East, interethnic violence in the Ottoman Empire, Palestinian history, and the history of the Armenian genocide. His publications include Shattered Dreams of Revolution, From Liberty to Violence in the Late Ottoman Empire, which received numerous awards, including the Society for Armenian Studies Outstanding Book Award in 2017. He is also the author of The Horrors of Adana, Revolution and Violence in the Early 20th Century, which was just published by Stanford University Press here in 2022. And this event, part of the World War I in the Middle East Summer Institute for K-12 educators, has been made possible in part by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. So thank you all for being tax-paying Americans and contributing to this. And thanks to you all as well who are members. It is because of that generosity of your time and the generosity of your spirit that we're able to bring important conversations like this one to you here and to all of you around the world who are watching. Will you please join me in welcoming Dr. Dermatosian to the stage?
Thank you very much for the invitation, Laura and Sherry. It's an honor to be here to talk to you, to the teachers, about one of the important aspects of the World War I, the Armenian genocide. So basically, the lecture will last around 1 hour, 1.5 hours, and I'm going to talk at the beginning about the concept of genocide, the definition of the concept of genocide, and then I'll move on providing a brief history of the Armenians, specifically within the Ottoman Empire, 19th century, the first wave of violence, which is the Hamidian massacres, the second wave of violence, which is the Adana massacres, and finally, I will concentrate on the Armenian genocide, its factors that led to the genocide, the repercussions, and of course, all of us know that genocide as a concept, as an event itself is such a complex event, such a complex phenomenon, that it's really difficult to analyze it from the perspective of history only. We need social scientific tools in order to understand the psychological aspects of genocide, the economic aspects of genocide. So whatever you're going to hear today is a basic presentation about the Armenian genocide. So let's start with the concept of genocide. The author of the concept of genocide was a Jewish jurist by the name of Raphael Lemkin, who was really troubled by the events that took place in the course of history, specifically about the Armenian genocide. When the British freed the perpetrators of the Armenian genocide in 1919, he wrote in his book, The Axis in Europe, that he was shocked by the juxtaposition and said, and I quote, "A nation was killed and the guilty persons were set free. Why is a man punished when he kills another man? Why is the killing of a million a lesser crime than the killing of single individual?" So he thought about different terms and terminologies, such as vandalism, barbarity, and finally he settled on the concept of genocide, which comes from Greek, genus, and side, meaning killing in Greek, and hence in his Axis rule in occupied Europe, one of the most important books that he wrote, he defined genocide by saying, by genocide, we mean the destruction of a nation or an ethnic group. Generally speaking, genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation, except when accomplished by mass killing of all members of a nation. It is intended rather to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. The objectives of such a plan would be disintegration of the political and social institutions of culture, language, national feelings, religion, and the economic existence of national group, and the destruction of the personal security, liberty, health, dignity, and even the lives of the individuals belonging to such groups. Genocide has two phases. One, the destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group, and second, the imposition of the national pattern over of the oppressor. Now, of course, this is Raphael Lemkin, born in 1900, passed away impoverished actually in 1950, and all his life he really fought hard to pass the concept of genocide as a legal definition in the United Nations. And finally, the United Nations Convention, called the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime, was adopted by the UN National General Assembly on December 9, 1948, as General Assembly Resolution 260. The convention entered into force on 12 January 1951. The detailed and quite technical definition is as follows. Article 1 indicates the contracting parties confirm that genocide, whether committed in time of peace or in time of war, is a crime under international law which they undertake to prevent and to punish. Second article, in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Killing members of the group. Second, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. Third, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. And finally, imposing measures intended to prevent the birth within the group. Finally, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Article 3, the following acts shall be punishable. First, genocide. Second, conspiracy to commit genocide. And third, direct and public incitement to commit genocide. Fourth, attempt to commit genocide. Fifth, complicity. And finally, fifth, complicity to genocide. As we can see, and this is extremely important, the convention placed stronger emphasis than Lemkin did on physical and biological destruction, and less on broader social destruction. This is due to the fact that the UN Genocide Convention was a compromise, because the major drafters of the convention, be it the United States or the colonial powers, other colonial powers, the British on the one hand and the Soviets on the other hand, prevented to include within the definition cultural genocide due to the responsibility of the British, the United States in perpetrating acts of cultural genocide against, or genocide to that extent, against native population. It's not only the United States, it's the case of Canada, it's the case of Australia, New Zealand, and also in the case of Soviet Union, they removed also the category of political groups due to the long history of the Soviet Union in decimating the political rivals within the Soviet Union, specifically during Stalin's terror. So there are different definitions of genocide. This is extremely important because if we want to discuss the Armenian genocide, there is always the denialist approach that the Armenian genocide does not fall into the category of genocide. But from genocide studies perspective, and genocide studies itself is a field, there are harder definition and softer definition of genocide. These definitions address agents, clear focus on state and official authorities. Second, victims, routinely defined as social minorities, because in all cases of genocides in the course of the modern period, always the victims are the minorities. Goals, the destruction and eradication of the victim group physically or culturally. The scale, total eradication in whole or in part. 6 strategies. What types of strategies? Lemkin refers to a coordinated plan of different actions. And finally, intent. Intent plays an important role in defining that the act of the crime itself is a genocide. And we're going to discuss here with the concept of intent in the case of the Armenian genocide. Where is the intent? Do we need a specific document that proves that there was an intent to commit a genocide? And this is the case with all other genocides. Intent itself is an important aspect. Most scholars and legal theorists agree that intent defines genocide. Prosecutors need only to prove that the criminal act was intentional and not accidental. And intent itself is divided between special intent, specific intent versus general intent. What are the differences? Specific intent, in a specific intent, there is a direct and manifest connection between the act and the outcome. Meaning you take a decision and you know that the result of that decision is going to be the annihilation of a specific group. The other intent, which is the general intent, the act and its genocidal consequences may be relatively widely separated in geographical and temporal terms. Meaning you take a decision to deport certain groups to an arid land, but you don't know the repercussions of that, and people would die during that, and so that's the general intent. I'll start the topic of the Armenian genocide today by quoting Ambassador Henry Morgenthau, the important figure, American figure, who was appointed as the ambassador of the United States to the Ottoman Empire. One of his quotes from his book is, "I'm confident that the whole history of the human race contains no such horrible episode as this. The great massacres and persecutions of the past seem almost insignificant when compared with the sufferings of the Armenian race in 1915. Of course, Armenians were not a race, Armenians were a nation, but the reason I'm quoting this is to show the magnitude of the awareness that the Americans had about the Armenian genocide. Armenian genocide, with its records, is part and parcel of American history too, with its diplomatic presence during the Armenian genocide, hundreds of thousands of documents, eyewitness accounts, American missionaries serving in the Ottoman Empire, all of them witnessed the Armenian genocide and reported back to the United States government. And even Morgenthau himself tried to force the United States to intervene on behalf of the Armenians, but he didn't succeed. Now, the Armenians, I don't know if you know, they're an ancient people, existed in the pre-1st century Common Era. They had a significant territory historically, and they're the first nation to adopt Christianity in 301 AD. And modern-day Armenia, what you see here, modern-day Armenia is the Republic of Armenia, which lies between Republic of Turkey and Republic of Azerbaijan. So Armenians have been in the region for a very long period of time, 2,000 to 3,000 years, and these areas actually in the dark brown actually are significant Armenian populations until 1915, and the historical Armenian territories are those that are in orange, specifically here, which is called Greater Armenia, and here in the section of Cilicia, which is also important city, is Adana. So Armenians were present in the region prior to the arrival of the Ottomans to the region. And the last Armenian independent kingdom that existed prior to the establishment of the Armenian Independent Republic in 1918 was the Kingdom of Cilicia between 1198 to 1375. And this is the map of the Cilician Kingdom, which is over the Mediterranean here in southeast Turkey. It played a dominant role during the Crusade period, and was a period of rejuvenation, period of cultural rejuvenation, cultural renaissance, political prowess, and also economic interactions with different parts of the region. Let us discuss about the Ottoman Armenians, and here is the most important aspect, I would say. Armenians lived in the Ottoman Empire for a very long time, I should say, until their annihilation during World War I. Armenians were considered as second-class citizens in the Ottoman Empire, and they lived mostly in the 6 Armenian provinces that I'm going to discuss in. They were never a majority, I should say, in these provinces. And of course, also relying on Ottoman censuses is problematic for reasons I can discuss later. But to that extent, Armenians lived in a better situation, I should say, than their counterpart in Russia. Of course, to understand the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, we have to also understand the condition of Armenians in the Russian Empire. Both of them, from time to time, persecuted Armenians. Nothing has to do with Christianity here. It has to do with Turkification and also with Russification. But Armenians in the Ottoman Empire were provided culture and religious autonomy. The concept here is the millet system, in which Armenians enjoyed vast array of freedoms that were given to them culturally and religiously. The leader of the Armenians was represented by the Armenian Patriarchate. It was a religious representation, and they had to pay taxes, of course. It was kind of a classical Islamic system of ruling, whereby the non-Muslims, Jews, and Christians had to pay specific tax and would enjoy the protection of the government, of the state. Armenians played an important role as merchants, industrialists, artists, and trade and architecturists in the 19th century. They played an important role in building the most important Ottoman edifices in the capital. But also 19th century in the Ottoman Empire was a century of challenge for the Ottoman Empire. If you put the Ottomans in the global economic system, the Ottomans moved from self-sustenance to becoming a semi-periphery in the global economic system. They were not colonized like China, similar to China, or similar to Iran, or similar to other places, but they were economically colonized, specifically as a result of the economic intervention of the European powers in the internal affairs of the economic systems of the Ottoman Empire. In order to strengthen its power, the Ottoman Empire initiated a vast array of reforms in the 19th century. These were called the Tanzimat reforms, 1839, 1876. The aim was to strengthen the state and the army in order to become a much more powerful state, with the aim of avoiding colonization, becoming victim to colonization. These reforms were good on paper, but in reality they didn't provide equality. But also they became counterproductive, because they were an authoritarian reform from top to bottom and did not serve the real aims. So eventually you have but these reforms also helped Armenians. Eventually you have the emergence of Armenian intelligentsia. You have Armenian culture nationalism emerging in the second half of the 19th century. But Armenian culture nationalism did not start within the Ottoman Empire. It started outside, in Venice, in Vienna, in Calcutta, in India. All of those centers played a dominant role in raising the awareness about the national past of Armenians. Of course, Armenian nationalism, as similar to all types of nationalism, is a modern phenomenon. Armenians existed as an ethno-religious groups or other religious groups, but due to modernization, they became aware about a kind of a national past, and hence became kind of nationalists. But cultural nationalism itself was also confined to the intelligentsia. It's not that all Armenians were nationalists. The majority of Armenians were peasants, and they lived in the east. They suffered depredations, they suffered double taxations and persecution by Kurdish tribes, by other elements within the east. So, and it was during this period that the Ottomans were able to achieve what came to be known as the first constitution period. And the first constitutional period is extremely important in the Ottoman Empire because the reformists in the Ottoman Empire were able to finally, after decades, to draft a constitution and open a parliament. That was the first semi-democratic experience of the Middle East in terms of in the Middle East, first semi-democratic experience. It was a constitutional monarchy because these reformists and the constitutional movement, the Ottoman constitutional movement, realized that the only way to strengthen the Ottoman Empire is to adopt the two important institutions that led to that strengthened the European countries, constitutionalism and parliament. However, as a result of the Russo-Turkish War of 1877, 1878, the Sultan Abdulhamid II closed the parliament and prorogued the constitution. And hence from 1878 to 1909, we see here a kind of authoritarian regime ruling the Ottoman Empire and a steep decline of the condition of the Armenians of the East. And this is where the Armenian question now emerges. The Armenian question became internationalized in the after the Congress of Berlin. But the Armenian question existed prior to that. In the 1860s, 1870s, the Armenian Patriarchate, the religious figure, wrote few reports to the Sublime Porte, to the government, saying that we are receiving thousands of complaints from the Armenians of the East about depredations, persecutions, double taxations, and we need to improve their lot. But nothing was done from the perspective of the government. And hence, after the Treaty of San Stefano in 1878, following the defeat of the Ottomans, there was Article 16 was passed, with the Russian pressure, of course, that promised to better the condition of the Armenians of the East. But immediately, the German, the British, the French weren't happy about the Russian meddling. They immediately convened another Congress, and now it was the Congress of Berlin, and changed Article 16 to 61, by which the Russians were going to secede from the areas that they had occupied in eastern Anatolia. And of course, with vague promises that the Ottomans were going to initiate reforms in the eastern provinces. Hence, after the Treaty of Berlin of 1878, the Armenian question was internationalized. Of course, one thing we have to remember, Armenians do not have friends in this environment. They're either used and abused by foreign powers, by Russians on the one hand, by the British on the one hand. And it depends on the decade that we're talking about. Once the Russians start persecuting Armenians, the British enter as the protectors of the Armenians. They started relying on the British. And then, after the British influence wanes, in 1913-14, they start looking at the Russians as the country that's going to save them from the clutches of the Ottomans, quote unquote. But eventually, Armenians realized that diplomacy is not working. We've tried hard. We've tried in San Stefano. We've tried in Berlin. So eventually, you have a small group of Armenian revolutionaries now emerging, and usually, official Turkish historiography represents these groups in isolation. We have to think these groups, revolutionary groups, in the global context, because revolutionary groups existed in other parts of the world. It was kind of the period of revolutionary movements. These were mostly influenced by Russian Narodniks, They were socialists, some of them radical socialists, and they believed, some of them did believe in reforming the Armenian condition in the Ottoman Empire. Some believed in autonomy under the cloud of the Ottoman Empire, while others believed in independence. And of course, the Balkan situation is also contributing to all of this, and eventually we see that these revolutionary movements start acting in the regions of the in the regions of the 6 Armenian provinces, and leading to major backlash by the Ottoman government, which came to be known as the first phase of major massacre, the Hamidian massacres between 1894-96. These are called the 6 Armenian provinces: Van, Bitlis, Diyarbakir, Harput or Memuret al-Aziz, Sivas, and Erzurum. They were known as the 6 Armenian provinces, or Western Armenia for Armenians, because Armenians refer to this section as Western Armenia and to this section as Eastern Armenia. So whatever exists today as the Republic of Armenia is Eastern Armenia. This does not exist anymore. And to what extent were Armenians a majority in the region depends on what census are we talking about, but I don't think that they formed any majority in any of these states, of the provinces. So these early massacres were covered by European press also. It led to the killing of around 100 to 300,000 Armenians. Aid for the victims became the first international mission of the American Red Cross. Of course, Europeans did interfere in this. Nearest Relief would raise more than 100 million in assistance to Armenians. But eventually, the European powers would intervene and force the Sultan to pass memorandums or memoranda in order to reform the condition of the Armenians of the East. So wherever there is a massacre, wherever there is a revolutionary activity, there is punitive collective punishment. If 10 Armenian revolutionaries committed an act, killed an Ottoman officers, the result is massive retaliation by the Ottomans. And today, within the current, in the current historiography, things are becoming more clear regarding regional variations during the Hamidian massacres, because as I said at the beginning, Armenian genocide usually takes the share within the historiography due to its magnitude. The Hamidian massacres, we don't have a single book that deals with the Hamidian massacres. Adana massacre is the same. We have few books here and there, but the Armenian genocide takes the share due to its magnitude. But these massacres that took place during the event, during the Hamidian period, are rarely covered within the historiography of the period. Now, of course, during this time in the 19th century, you have the emergence of a new group, exiled Ottoman groups called the Young Turks. They were influenced by the European political thought, positivism, Darwinism, and many other constitutionalism, many other currents, ideological currents that were raging within Europe. And they wanted to bring a change in the Ottoman Empire. They were exiled. They were emigres living in capital cities in London, Paris, Cairo, and many other places. They believed in peaceful resolution to bringing down the Sultan, not through revolution. They believed in evolution. Sorry, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for evolution, and they did not want any European intervention in bringing down the Sultan. And the Young Turks were in discussion with other groups who were exiled, be them Armenian, Greeks, Albanians, Arabs, in order to create kind of an Ottoman opposition to be able to bring down the authoritarian Sultan and also bring back the constitution and the Ottoman parliament. After a long period of activities, to make a long story short, after 2 meetings, the Congress of 1902 of the Ottoman opposition groups and the Congress of 1907, finally the Young Turk Revolution takes place in July of 1908. It was a major event within the Middle East. It was an event that shaped the modern Middle East, I should say. It was an event could have led to the World War I, but it was an important event. It was an event that brought hope. And I wrote my first book called Shattered Dreams of Revolution, From Liberty to Violence in the Late Ottoman Empire. It was brought major hope for Armenians, for Arabs, Albanians, Jews, and many other groups, that finally they're going to live in brotherhood, in equality, in liberty, and they're going to create a new identity called Ottomanism. But as I show in my book, the euphoria is really in any type of revolution today. Think about the Arab Spring, the euphoric feeling that we saw in the Arab Spring, that this is a new beginning, that this is a new beginning in which everyone was going to live in harmony. But once the euphoric feelings ended, the real litmus test of Ottomanism began. What I found that there is contradictory understanding of Ottomanism itself, contradictory expectations from the authors of the revolution, the Young Turks and the other groups, the Armenians, etc. One believed in centralization, the Young Turks. The other believed in decentralization, administered decentralization. In their writings, they sometimes refer to the federal state, federal United States as a federal system. They said, why can't we copy the United States system? For the Young Turks, realizing what's happening in Europe, in the European part of the Ottoman Empire, they said, once we provide you with administrative decentralization, we know what's going to happen. You're immediately going to jump to political decentralization and eventually ask for autonomy. The Ottomanism of the Young Turks had a strong flavor of Turkism too. So they were perceived, their actions were perceived by the other non-dominant group as Turkification policies. Because they said, if we're thinking about Ottomanism, the main language should be Turkish. All other non-Muslim elements within the Ottoman Empire have to give up their privileges. Churches have to give up their privileges on education system, and the Minister of Education has to be the final, arbiter in the education system. All of these actions were perceived as negative steps by the Armenians and other groups. However, they still continued negotiating. But one thing we have to remember, that the Young Turk Revolution was a bloodless revolution. And this actually was mentioned within the press at the time. A bloodless revolution means that there is a major strata of society that benefited from the Ancien regime that now wants to hit back. And of course, if you think about it, the Young Turk Revolution was heavily influenced by the French Revolution. The French Revolution, they accepted the French Revolution as an ahistoric model in realizing its objective. They never problematized the Young Turk Revolution, the French Revolution, because if you think about the French Revolution, it was a bloody revolution. It was a very problematic revolution, unlike what people think about liberty, fraternity, etc. So this is an extremely important point. So eventually what's going to happen is that they're going to hit back the conservative elements were going to, reactionary forces were going to hit back in 1909 in what became to be known as the events of 31st of March 1909. But I'd like to show you some revolutionary mottos. Here it says, long live Ottomanism, long live fatherland. And this is an extremely important postcard that shows the euphoria of the revolution. It's the postcard was presented by different languages, in Ladino here, Judeo-Spanish, in French here, in Ottoman here, in Greek here, and in Armenian here. Kind of that all of us now are Ottomans, and here another discipline, justice, and order, another memento, here another image. These are postcards actually that were spread around during the revolution. Here you have United for the Fatherland, and every ethnic group is represented. The Circassian here, the Arab here, the Greek here, the Armenian here, etc. And the Bulgarian here. I think this is Bulgarian. So the counter-revolution was eventually suppressed by the Action Army. The Young Turks lost power for a small period of time, but they were able to come back to power due to the Action Army. But it was only in the province of Adana here that the the counter-revolution spun into spiral violence. And Adana plays an important role for the Armenians, not only economically, it also plays an important role as a hub for cotton, but also as the area where the ancient Armenian kingdom of Cilicia existed. The result was the massacring of 20,000 Armenians and the killing of 2,000 Muslims. And this is the book. You can purchase it if you want. No pressure, but this is the book I wrote about the horrors of Adana, kind of a new reinterpretation of the massacres themselves by providing an interdisciplinary approach, by not looking at it Armenians versus Muslims, etc., these outdated ancient tropes, but rather understanding it as a violent episode. So these are some pictures from the city of Adana. Everything was destroyed and ruined. So, the road to World War I, of course, the Adana massacres shook the foundation of trust of the Armenians towards the Young Turks. Those who were opposed to any cooperation with the Young Turks, such as the Hunchaks or other Armenian revolutionary groups, they told the others that we told you, don't cooperate with them. Whereas the Dashnaks, which was the major Armenian Revolutionary Federation groups, still continued its cooperation with the Young Turks. And of course, until today, there is the kind of the debate whether the CUP, the Central CUP, Central Young Turk Party, the Committee of Union and Progress, had anything with any meddling with the Adana massacres. I say no, others say yes, but I think these phases of violence are separate phases of violence, something that I'm going to discuss in a second. The Balkan Wars was a major blow to the Ottomans. They lost about 95% of their holdings in the European section of the Ottoman Empire. And the Balkan Wars also gave kind of encouragement to the Armenians to revive the Armenian question once more. And Russia played an important role in this. So what came to be known as the Armenian Reform Project of 1913-14 aimed at dividing the Ottoman Armenian provinces, the 6 vilayets, 6 provinces, into 2 sections, where the centers were going to be Van and Erzurum, and they were going to be governed by either 2 European inspectors or 2 Ottoman Christian inspectors. The first one was appointed was Westenek, and the other one was Hof. One of them was a Belgian, I think, the other was Norwegian. And but it wasn't realized because Ottoman Empire entered World War I in 1914. Of course, I'm not going to discuss in detail the World War I in the Ottoman Empire, because you've heard that from Professor Aksakal earlier. The Ottoman Empire entered World War I in October 1914. They attacked to the east, hoping to capture the city of Baku in what would be a disastrous campaign against the Russian forces in the Caucasus. They were soundly defeated at the Battle of Sarikamish. And of course, they blamed the Armenians for siding with the Russians, and the Young Turks began campaign to portray the Armenians as a kind of fifth column, a threat to the state. And this brings me to an important question. Did the Armenians side with the Russians? Maybe some. Some did side with the Russians with the hope that the Russians were going to provide them independence. There were units actually that participated from the Russian side, Armenian units mobilized by the Russians. But there were also some individuals, a couple of hundreds of people who moved to the Caucasus to fight against the Ottomans. But the leadership, both the religious leadership in the Ottoman Empire, Armenian religious leadership, and the Armenian Revolutionary Federation took a decision that they were going to be neutral not going to take any sides. And this is a map that shows the directions of the campaigns. You have 3 fronts open. Professor Talon also spoke about this earlier. You have the Western Front, the Gallipoli, led to the defeat of the British, was a victory for the Ottomans. The Sarikamish was a disaster. And then you have the Southern Front, the British capture of Jerusalem, December 1915, and the British capture of Baghdad. Of course, Europeans are not there to save anyone. They're not there to save anyone. They're there to divide the Ottoman Empire, to share whatever that they gain from the Ottoman Empire, whether it's in Baghdad, Kirkuk, the oil, or whether it's to preserve the route towards India by the British or the other French interest. Of course, these are classically represented as the major perpetrators of the Armenian genocide. Talat Pasha, the Minister of Interior, was a key figure in initiating the genocide. Second, we have Enver Pasha, the Minister of War, who was a Germanophile. Of course, Germany played an important role in supporting the Ottoman army at the time, and the Ottomans relied on the Germans with the hope that if Germany wins the war, will become victorious now and be free from the clutches of the British, the French, and the Russians. And last but not least is Jamal Pasha, Minister of Navy. Jamal's role is now becoming more questionable, I think. Recent historiography is trying to show that he was in between. It's a gray zone for him. It's not clear-cut that he is one of the triumvirates. How the genocide was perpetrated, of course, special groups of Turks and Kurds, often made up of released prisoners, were created to carry out the massacres, prominent of which was the special organization headed by Dr. Bahauddin Shakir. But these groups that were released from the prisons, actually, as a result of temporary laws that were attached by the government, they were released in order to serve in the army. And some of them were sent to the east to fight against the Armenians or take part in the genocide. Most Armenian men were drafted into the army, then disarmed and put into labor camps. Those who were put into labor camps were the suspicious, quote-unquote, elements, and Armenians constituted the majority, I would say, of the labor camps. They mostly were designated to work on the railroad, Baghdad-Berlin Railroad, in the Amanos or Tarsus, Amanos Mountains, and afterwards they were liquidated. So community leaders were arrested on April 24, 1915 in Constantinople, Istanbul, and put to death soon after. With all its able-bodied men in the army and without its leadership, the Armenian population now was defenseless and more vulnerable than ever. And these are some images of the major Armenian intellectuals that were arrested and killed as a result of the Armenian genocide. Most prominent of whom are Grigor Zohrab, Taner Varuzhan, Ruben Zartanian. These are the cream of the Armenian intellectual elite. So if you think about it, the Armenian genocide wasn't only the physical destruction of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, but also destruction of the intellectual legacy that wasn't passed to a future generation. Of course, in the past, the Armenian genocide was considered as one event. It started in 1915, ended up in 1923. But recent scholarship has come to demonstrate that the Armenian genocide had at least 2 phases, for sure. First phase is the Young Turks liquidation plan that targeted only the population of the 6 eastern provinces considered to be the Armenians' historical lands in spring and fall of 1915. This is the first phase. 6 Armenian vilayets that they were called, in which there were a strong presence of Armenians, and was considered as the historical homeland by Armenians. The second phase is between February and December 1916, targeted whoever left alive from these caravans, and also the population of Cilicia, and were taken to the concentration camps in Syria or Upper Mesopotamia. So the decision to destroy these remaining, whatever remained out of the two phases, was taken in late February or early March 1916 and affected 500,000 surviving deportees who had reached Syria and Mesopotamia at least 6 months earlier. Some add a final phase between 1919 and 1922, where about 20% of Armenians from Cilicia, 20% of the Armenians of Cilicia who survived the genocide went back to Cilicia, and then as a result of the Mustafa Kemalist offense, they had to leave back, and some were massacred even. So that's called the final phase, which is 1919 and 1922. This is a very important map that shows the direction of the movement of the caravans. Of course, Armenians did not take business class, not business class as class, but they did not take the business class on planes or first class. They had to walk under dire condition from far away places like Sivas and all the way down to this area of Aleppo. I've done extensive work on Sivas, for example, and followed the caravans, Kangal, Malatya, and eventually ending up here. Again, there is more research that's coming up from historians trying to show the sophisticated aspect, or complex aspect of the genocide. It wasn't kind of clear-cut, the Turk is the enemy. There were many Muslims and Turks who helped Armenians to survive, who helped Armenians specifically in the areas of Dersim, for example, and other areas. And this shows the concentration camps which were built during the 1916 period. And eventually all of those were destroyed, and the rest were sent down to the desert. How the genocide was carried: of course, armed groups would come to a village and take remaining able-bodied males to the outskirts of town and massacre them. And of course, I've read a lot of memoirs, and I've listened to a lot of oral testimonies. Oral testimonies, we have about 1,300 oral testimonies from the Armenian genocide. This was a major project carried out during the 1970s. Now everyone is dead, there's nothing, there's no one existed. All of them will say the same thing. One day, one night in April or May, they came, knocked on the door, took my dad, and we never heard back from him. Women, children, and elderly then ordered to prepare for deportation. Valuables were registered and stored for safekeeping. Caravans were preyed upon by marauding bands, stole remaining valuables, raped, and killed survivors. And of course, girls were carried off, children enslaved and raised as Kurds or Turks. Another aspect is nature played a dominant role also in the annihilation of Armenians: starvation, disease, exposure, brutality, massacres. Most of those that made it to the desert were killed. One important aspect also recent research has showing is regional variations of the Armenian genocide. That the Armenian genocide was not kind of, we're giving the order and it's all implemented par excellence on the ground. It all dependent on the local exigencies, the cooperation or the lack of cooperation of certain notables, interest groups. In some areas, for example, the governor said, "I'm not going to implement anything." They were taken out of position. Other places, like at Diyarbakir, the governor was fierce anti-Armenian and played a dominant role in initiating the genocide against Armenians. And there are other major important officers that did not want to rejected to be part of the plan. So this is very important thing to represent, that genocide itself is a complex phenomenon. It takes place based on different variations within the provinces. You cannot have specific, not everyone is obeying the order, let's say. Of course, Jesse Jackson The Council of Aleppo says between 4,300, 4,500 families, 28,000 people are being removed by order of the government from the districts of Zaytun and Marash. This is in Cilicia. Marash, I'm a descendant of Marash. My family came from Marash, where they are known, and in distinctly non-Christian communities. Thousands have already been sent northwest into province of Konya, Caesarea, which is Kayseri, Kastamonu, while others have been taken southeasterly as far as Deir Zor, and reports say to the vicinity of Baghdad. Why I'm quoting this? This is another testimony yet from American Consul Jesse Jackson. All of these types of eyewitness accounts or reports by Americans were sent to the American government. And hence, that's why I say the Armenian genocide, well, as the testimony of the Armenian genocide is part also American eyewitness account. The Armenian genocide did not only target the physical Armenian destruction, it also targeted the Armenian economy and Armenian properties. Armenians were doing well in the second half of the 19th century as industrialists, factory owners, merchants, and all their houses were confiscated by the Ottoman government and appropriated by the Turkish Republic. And this confiscation appropriation binary plays an important role also in the emergence of the Muslim bourgeoisie class during the Republican period. Only a small number of Armenians remained in the former Ottoman capital of Constantinople. What were the reactions to the Armenian genocide? Most Armenians didn't know what was happening until it was too late. People really thought that they were going out for deportation and then they're going to come back eventually. Some did come back after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, but others never had the chance to come back. My grandfather always had said that he might, after the first decade of being deported, he said that he thought he might return back eventually. Nothing happened. Church leaders at the time urged villagers not to give in to provocation. Some organized self-defense or fled. It's not that Armenians were only victims that did fight. There were uprisings in Zvan and other places, but these were minor in comparison to what was happening. Turks, Kurds, and others, many took advantage of the situation, looting, killing. It was an important opportunity now to make a material gain out of the genocide too. It's not only that, it's not Islam, that's why we're killing. There's also economic dimension of the genocide. It's an easy access to money, easy access to property. Some risk their lives, some Muslims, Turks, Kurds, risk their lives to help save Armenians. Foreigners, many news reports, diplomatic protests, some were able to save Armenians, such as missionaries, or the Near East Relief, or the American Red Cross, but there was no humanitarian intervention. The concept of humanitarian intervention is an important concept because it goes back to the 19th century. Humanitarian intervention entails that whenever there was the fear or the act of massacres, European powers intervened in the Ottoman Empire. They intervened in the case of Greece, in the case of Damascus, and in the case of Crete. But they never intervened in the case of the Hamidian massacres, in the case of the Adana massacres, in the case of the Armenian genocide. Davide Rodogno, an important scholar on the humanitarian intervention, says, for example, that unless there was no consensus among the European powers that no one is going to gain anything out of intervention, no one would intervene. They will only intervene if no one was going to gain anything out of it. But realizing the European powers at the time, they weren't interested in humanitarianism, no one intervened because they had different policies. Some were anti-Russian, some were pro-Russian, some were with the Ottoman Empire, some were against Armenians, some were against Ottomans. So again, this idea of European intervention, humanitarian intervention, is a very problematic concept. There is no humanitarianism, there is no intervention for the sake of helping Christian lives. And this is something that I also discuss in The Horrors of Adana, that second book. New York Times mentioned extensively about the Armenian genocide. You can go to the New York Times website, and the caricature that I showed you at the beginning of the talk was from the New York Times 2015 edition, April 13, by New York Times caricaturist, cartoonist Patrick Chapete, in which he says, you remember the Ottoman officer is telling everyone, enter the train, that the concept of genocide does not exist yet. That's one of the denialist approach to understand what's happening. This is a basic kind of result. For example, 1914, there were 225,000 Armenians in the province of Sivas. Then you have 5,000. So these are the major Armenian provinces that existed in this section. As you can see, these are the 6 Armenian provinces. And you see you have a really major number here. If you add all of them, it would be above 1 million Armenians living there. And the result here may be about 15 to 20,000 Armenians. But again, as I said, besides the Armenian provinces here, Armenians did come back to this section of Adana, a few thousands of them, with the hope that the French were going to provide them with the protection and become a French colony, but that did not take place, and they were betrayed by the French, and until today they talk about it. Another important thing that we have to discuss here, the way in which European powers, the British and the French, used minorities in the Ottoman Empire by mobilizing them, by giving them false promises that once the war ends, you'll get whatever you want. Arabs, as you saw, Armenians, Assyrians, many other groups. Armenians were part of the Légion d'Orient in the French army. The British incited Armenians to uprise, for example, with the aim and hope that they're going to get independence, but nothing happened. What's the aftermath? 1914, there were 2,538 Armenian churches, 451 monasteries, and nearly 2,000 schools. Today, outside of Istanbul, Armenians possess 6 churches, no monasteries, and no school. Nearly all movable properties was either confiscated by the government, looted by the mobs, or seized during the death marches. By 1923, a 3,000-year-old civilization virtually ceased to exist. And the remaining Armenians who lived in the beginning of the Republican period after the Lausanne Treaty suffered extreme persecution and discrimination. 1.5 million, more than 1/2 of Armenian population on historic homeland were disseminated. Now, of course, Americans played an important role in saving the Armenians. Famous, I think maybe the museum has these posters, I'm not sure. The famous one is "They Shall Not Perish." Armenian girl is kind of hugging the Lady Liberty here. Give or we perish. So about over $1 billion US dollar was raised for the Armenians during in the aftermath of the Armenian genocide. And the concept of starving Armenians, which is very problematic, but at the time made sense actually, was a part of the American culture. If you ask your grandparents during Sunday dinners, they would say, eat, eat and remember the starving Armenians. So, repercussions of the Armenian genocides, creation of the modern diaspora. Around 55,000 Armenians live in Istanbul. The names of Armenian villages, cities, mountains, rivers, and even animals have been changed to Turkish names. Ancient churches and other historic sites are being intentionally neglected or destroyed. Much of Armenian culture has been lost, and nearly all traces of 4,000, that's an exaggeration, of 2,000 years of Armenian existence on those lands are being eliminated. So what's the genocide denial? Of course, in genocide studies, denial, according to Gregory Stanton, is the last phase of genocide, because denial is a continuation of the genocide. When you deny, you are causing not only psychological but also mental trauma, continuing the traumatic suffering of the descendants of the genocide, if not the genocide survivors. To this day, the Turkish government is actively and aggressively engaged in genocide denial. Everyone knows that the Turkish government monitors all activities in the United States universities. Whenever there is a genocide conference, they immediately send a representative to try to block that. But since 2021, when United States officially recognized the Armenian genocide, things have been more calm, I think. Turkey currently pays millions to US lobbying and PR firms to plan and implement its denial campaign with the US government and the US media. This is true before 2021. It continues until today. Turkey has funded Turkish studies programs to promote Turkish view in order to counter Armenian allegations. And today, due to changes in technology and methods of communication, denial has become much more efficient because you don't need to go to a lecture in order to make your case about the so-called Armenian genocide. It's through internet, through social media, you can represent your case. Also, court cases have been filed about the Armenian genocide under the rubric of freedom of speech, that denial of genocide is part of freedom of speech. I'm expressing my point of view. You can't criticize me. I can deny whatever I want. I can deny the Holocaust. I can deny anything. So you cannot, judge me. That's their argument. Also, scholarship plays an important role here, quote-unquote scholarship, because there are at least one U.S. press that publishes denialist scholarship under the umbrella of legitimate scholarship. What do denialists say? Of course, denialism in Turkish denialism has shifted in the course of history. One thing we have to remember also that crimes that were perpetrated by the Young Turks were accepted after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, but by the Ottoman government in Istanbul, there were military tribunals that were established accepting the crimes. But after the Republican period, a long process of denialism began. It was a civil war. The numbers of the Armenian death is grossly inflated. We are the real victims. They died exposed to harsh climate conditions. More Muslims died during the same period. Armenians sided with Russia in plotting against the empire. When you say Armenians sided with Russia, it means that 1 million Armenians took weapons and went and fought against Russia. If few hundred Armenians joined the Russian army as units, does not justify a genocide. Armenians began using the term genocide after the 1960s because they wanted to copy the case of the Holocaust. Again, some denialists would say, well, the concept of genocide did not exist back then. We shouldn't call it genocide. So does this mean that every case of mass murder that falls under the category of genocide should not be called genocide? Of course, finally, after long efforts by Armenian groups, human rights groups, Armenian lobbies, Armenian activist groups, the House of Representatives and the Senate passed the Resolution 296 in October 29 and December 12 consecutively, which says, whereas the United States has a proud history of recognizing and condemning the Armenian genocide, the killing of 1.5 million Armenians by the Ottoman Empire from 1915 to 1923, and providing relief to the survivors of the Armenian campaign of genocide against the Armenians, Greeks, Assyrians, Chaldeans, Syriacs, Arameans, Maronites, and other Christians. Of course, it not only does not target the Armenians, but this was a major step forward towards recognizing the Armenian genocide. And President Biden, on his April 24 statement, recognized the Armenian genocide, but saying each year on this day, we remember the lives of all those who died in the Ottoman era Armenian genocide, and recommit ourselves to preventing such atrocity from ever again occurring. Beginning on April 24, 1915, with the arrest of the Armenian intellectuals and community leaders in Constantinople by Ottoman authorities, 1.5 million Armenians were deported, massacred, or marched to their death in a campaign of extermination. We honor the victims of the Medzieran in Armenian means the great catastrophe, so that the all horrors of Adana would happen. horrors of what happened, not Adan, horrors of what happened are never lost to history. And remember, so that we remain ever vigilant against the corrosive influence of hate in all its forms. Now, final section of this discussion would deal with the million-dollar question. What led to the Armenian genocide? Some scholars would argue that religion played an important role. It was Muslims versus Christians. It was the hatred of Christian, and that led to the Armenian genocide. This approach has been debunked because genocide is a very much complex phenomenon. You cannot attribute it to one factor. Is it nationalism? Was it a clash of nationalisms? If it's a clash of nationalisms, then you would expect that the Armenian nationalism is on par, on the same level of Turkish nationalism, so it's a clash of nationalisms. I don't buy that either. Wasn't a land issue, a territory issue. There is a much more an important argument here, which is the following: that in the end of the day, the Young Turks were imperial nationalists. They wanted to preserve the Ottoman Empire. Of course, nationalism and imperialism, or empire, nationalism, empire, are antithesis. But for the case of the Young Turks, they were imperial nationalists. They wanted to preserve the territorial integrity of the Ottoman Empire, even if that meant to get rid of the Armenian question, which was a major, from their perspective, a major problem for the constant European meddling and Russian meddling in the internal affairs of the Ottoman Empire. So land plays an important role. Was it a premeditated event, meaning was there a blueprint before entering the war, saying that in 1913 or 14 they took a decision, and then once we get into the war, then we'll implement the genocide. I don't think that there is a blueprint per se prior to World War I, and decisions for the genocide were taking place as the war was happening, and that's why we have the concept of cumulative radicalization, meaning eventually these are taking place in 1915, 16, and 17. And of course, it is a centralized, unlike what's represented in Turkish nationalist historiography, that Ottoman Empire was in a chaotic situation. There wasn't center or periphery. It was a central administration ruling the periphery too. Orders were going from the center. And as I said, the results were varied depending on the local exigencies within different regions. So cumulative radicalization took place during World War I in order to solve the Armenian question. It wasn't a religious factor. It was more an imperial national factor, I think, to preserve the integrity of the Ottoman Empire. I also disagree with the continuum approach that is prominent in certain historiographies of the field. The continuum approach argues that the Armenian genocide is the result of a longer phase of genocides that took place in the course of history. And they view the genocide at the beginning of the Hamidian massacres, and it ends with the Armenian genocide. So it was kind of a continuum process. I disagree with this approach. I think that Hamidian massacres took place in a different setting, had its own, had a different factors contributing to it. The Adana massacres, which I'm very familiar with, is not part of a continuum. And it's a separate event taking place as a result of the revolution. I would say a major event is the revolution that led to the disruption of the power equilibrium that existed in the region, and finally the Armenian genocide. Because these are different events. But one thing is important. One thing important that we have to remember: the level of tension that existed in the East by the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, where a major or minor event would lead to a cataclysmic violence. So, of course, as in the Holocaust literature, you have also intentionalists versus functionalists. Did the Turks hate Armenians so much that they implemented genocide? Then you have functionalists. And I believe in functionalism in the Armenian genocide. It's not that everyone hated the Armenians and that's why they were waiting for the opportunity to kill all of them. So Armenian genocide was followed by other Ottoman genocides, let's say Ukrainian famine, happening when you see what's happening in Ukraine, the Holocaust, Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, and hopefully nothing in the future, but I'm pessimist because we never learn from the past, and never again is just a motto which doesn't serve anyone, I think. Thank you very much.
Dr. Dermatosian, thank you very much. And if you are in our audience, I would invite you to either of the standing mics on either side of the auditorium. And if you are online, I would invite you to our live chat.
Well, I'll lead off with the first question, and I'm very interested in the reporting. With so many of the other genocides that have occurred throughout history, it took really large efforts to make the countries outside and people outside of the area where they were taking place aware. Can you speak at all to how the West and the world became aware of what was happening to the Armenians in 1915 and onward?
Where at the time when the event was taking place, everyone was aware as to what was happening, but eventually, things change with the British colonialism, French colonialism in the Middle East, the mandate system, Turkish-American relationship strengthened, because mainly for the US it was economic interest rather than moral interests, and eventually things faded. The only people kept talking about the genocide were the Armenians themselves, and it took few generations to really raise it on the international level. That's very important. But also we have to remember the Turkish Republic's stance towards the Armenians and towards the Armenian genocide. For example, in 1933, when Franz Werfel wrote The 40 Days of Musadag, in 1934, MGM wanted to make a movie out of it. Has anyone read The 40 Days of Musadag? A very important book, actually. And 1934, they wanted to make an MGM movie about it. Immediately, the Turkish government contacts the embassy. Ambassador Ertegun at the time puts pressure on the American government to really put aside this project. This is 1934. And since then, since the beginning, 1920s, the beginning of the Turkish Republic, not only the Ottoman past was decimated, but also any relation to Armenians or anything about Armenians was really sidelined. Not only Armenians, but other ethnic groups. So Turkish history for the Turkish Republic began in 1919, in May. So, with Kemal Atatürk.
Can you speak a little bit about you mentioned that there were about 50,000 Armenians right now in Istanbul. What's that situation like? Are they welcome there? Do they still experience persecution?
A very good question. Yes, they are living as long as they don't get involved in politics, let's say, in Armenian diasporic politics. They don't talk about genocide. They don't initiate events. But also, I have to talk here about. I need to talk here about Turkish scholars who, for the past 3 decades, have been also talking about the Armenian genocide and doing research. New research is coming out from Turkish scholars about the Armenian genocide. So it's no more the 70s or the 60s where you have everyone running under the same banner. And these people are even recently they're being criticized, some of them jailed too, for their views. But the Armenians are living in a kind of a quote-unquote hostage situation in Istanbul. They are a religious group, not national group. They're represented by their own religious figure. They have their national kind of councils. As long as they're not kind of involved in political issues, dealing with the with diaspora or diasporic politics, criticizing Turkey or on that sense. It's a minority game card that they play on.
So you started speaking to an extent near the end, but there are so many other groups in the Ottoman Empire that are developing this national consciousness near the end of, or during this period. Is there any other kind of investigation into the uniqueness of the Armenians as a target? Why weren't Greek Christians treated to the same extent? Obviously they were probably targeted, but why was it that 99% of them or 90% of Armenians were killed as opposed to in other groups?
I mean, it's not only that Armenians were killed, Pontian Greeks were killed. The Saipho took place with the Assyrian genocide in the region, in southern region, Urmia and upper section. But Armenians were kind of the largest Christian minority in the Ottoman Empire, and they were positioned in a very strategic position in the Ottoman Empire. And when the Ottoman Empire lost its Balkan properties, or provinces, the Anatolia became the Turkish heartland, Turkish nationalist heartland. So anything, and the fear, there was a fear by the Turks too. There's not justifiable fear, but there was a fear that Armenians are going to side with the Russians, and the Russians are going to liberate Armenia, and then we're going only to take place, we're going to have only Istanbul and Bursa, and that's it, and the whole Ottoman Empire is going to collapse.
And we have time for 2 more questions. The first is going to come from YouTube, and the second will be here from the stairs. Lawrence Kafer, hopefully I say your name correctly, wanted to follow up with your comment about religion. Seeing that some Armenians were spared, or that there is evidence or discussion about that, when they converted to Islam, didn't a jihad mentality play a part in the genocide?
Of course, jihad as a concept itself was Germany was behind the concept of jihad too. It was a mobilization tool. It wasn't that everyone believed in jihad, all right? And I mean, Germany is a kind of Christian country, and it's your ally. Jihad is a mobilization tool. But some Armenians did convert to Islam. And today we have the phenomenon of Islamicized Armenians. Some Armenians converted to Islam out of necessity, and some switched back to Christianity. Some remained as Muslims, but not large categories. But you have other Armenians who switched to Protestant Armenians or Catholic Armenians to be under the protection of the British or the French, but it didn't matter for the Ottomans or the Young Turks or whatever was the government at the time, leaders, that you're Armenian at the end of the day. But they did switch to became Muslims, and they were saved as such. It was sometimes you have hundreds of people doing that, sometimes a whole village, but the majority were killed during the genocide. There was the option, actually. There was the option. Sometimes that option was not presented.
Have there been any modern movements or semi-modern movements to try and preserve or revive any of the remaining Armenian culture that possibly was lost?
Yeah, very, very good point. I mean, there are certain non-profit organizations in Turkey. One of them is the Anatolian Culture non-profit organization whose leader Osman Kavala is today in the prison. So that tells you a lot about the efforts of non-profit organizations. But to that extent, I mean, besides Van, the Holy Cross Church in Van, which was renovated, not as a church, but as an edifice, I should say, because Armenians are not allowed to hold a mass in that church. Then you have in Diyarbakir Also the St. Garabet Church, which was renovated and then destroyed and lately renovated. But these are by local, the St. Garabet Church, by local efforts. It's not a government effort, but there is no any effort by the government to revive Armenian culture or cultural heritage. And, because then we're going to open the Pandora's box if you start reviving cultural heritage. So that's an intentional policy. I think it's not that they can't do it. They can do it. And as a matter of fact, today there are groups that go from Armenia. There are tours that go from Armenia to Eastern Anatolia, quote unquote Western Armenia. They visit Van. They go to Adana and other places as part of, pilgrimage. And that's in the past 3 decades, you have this new phenomenon by Armenians, specifically Armenian Americans, but also other places that go on pilgrimage tour to visit their ancestral homelands or their villages, where many people, some have kept their keys, for example, but others, they want to see the place that their grandmother used to live, for example, or parents used to live.
Now, I know that some of you still have more questions, and I believe Dr. Matosian will answer those afterwards, and I would highly suggest that you pick up any of his publications on Amazon or your local bookstore or your local library, who is always happy to have your membership as well. Would you please join me in a warm round of applause for Dr. Bedros Dermatosian?
Thank you.